My name is Marissa Gilman, and I will be your moderator for this very exciting session on Building Back Better, a circular economy approach to advancing the Sustainable Development Goals. This webcast is brought to you by the Zayed Sustainability Prize, the UAE's pioneering annual global award in sustainability. This award recognizes and rewards the achievements of those who are driving impactful, innovative, and inspiring sustainability solutions across 5 distinct categories: health, food, energy, water, and global high schools. The prize is accepting applications through June 11th, and we hope all of you will consider applying and passing this opportunity on to someone you know. With that, I'm really excited to introduce our guest today, Mr. David McGinty. David is the Global Director of the World Economic Forum's Platform for Accelerating the Circular Economy, or PACE, an initiative to drive public-private action and collaboration on the circular economy. I have a few questions for David to get the conversation started, and we'll also save time for questions from you all as well. Please enter questions in the chat box below. David, thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm doing great. It's a beautiful day in the Netherlands.
Oh, that's wonderful. We all really enjoy the lovely weather right now. So I'm really impressed by the work that you've been leading through PACE to promote circular economy. We're seeing global priorities and conversations shift dramatically as well since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. Can you tell us why we need to pursue a global circular economy and how this crisis is impacting efforts to do so?
Sure, thanks for the opportunity to share a little bit here. Look, we were facing a bit of a crisis in the world before the COVID pandemic, and there are just some basic demographics around the 3 core elements that exist in the world. We got people, we have stuff, and we have energy. And the number of people continues to massively grow. The amount of natural resources that our population's consuming grew at over twice the rate of population growth in the last century. And while that's happening, we are consuming more materials by GDP as well. So not only are we increasing the amount of stuff we're consuming by the population, but also by the economic indicators. And why does that matter? What's happening is as we take and use more stuff, we're polluting the air. That's resulting in about 9 million annual deaths a year that are unnecessary from pollution. About 90% of global biodiversity loss and 50% of the greenhouse gas emissions can be attributed to excessive resource consumption. And we only reuse about 9% of the materials we take. So if we could address that gap between the materials that we use and make it a more efficient use and reuse of those materials, then we can hopefully improve the economic viability of our countries and our communities, as well as the overall health of our communities. And so those issues have been really exacerbated and in some ways magnified by the COVID pandemic in a few different areas.
I'm curious with that, where you see the role of innovation playing. We're seeing that these broader themes come up. For example, the European Commission recently published their circular economy platform, but at the same time, we're seeing consumer behavior shift as well with a return to single-use plastic. So what are those important themes, and what is the role of innovation here in building back better with regard to circular economy?
Yeah, so maybe I can address the kind of fundamental issues that are coming up in circular economy as a result of the COVID pandemic. One is that the community that's working on this agenda have really looked to secure momentum, and you mentioned some of that. So there was great momentum with the European Green Deal coming out, and under that, a circular economy action plan released just before we really started to feel the pain here in 2020. We had the momentum of over 800 companies signing up to science-based targets, which was a massive movement. We had some positive signs coming out of COP25 with national level commitments. So one key thing during the pandemic has been, how do we both respond, but also get the global community to secure the momentum that was already there to have a more ambitious coming decade on climate action and securing our economies. And what's happened is, as all the things that we've experienced, a slowdown in the economy, we've moved home in some ways, and we've started to really have this magnifying glass on global supply chains. And you become a little bit more intimate with the stuff you're consuming and how you're moving, what your life could look like. And it starts to become possible to think that there's a way that we can redesign our world. And you can see this momentum and potential. Kind of, this a little cheesy, but you can see the human will coming behind and saying, you know what, actually, maybe we can create this kind of transformation to envision a new world. And that's the positive thing that's coming as we're trying to kind of combat with the pandemic. Is there's this moment where we can say to ourselves, yeah, we can actually create this type of change in our communities. And the circular economy system is one way to look at that change. And within that, there are a lot of different areas that innovation can play a part.
And I'm curious specifically in those, what are the top areas that you see innovation playing? What are the key things that we should be thinking about here?
Yeah, so the kind of trends that are coming up, we'll take the innovation point. That's to your, more direct to your question. One is I think the more that an innovator can look at how to help people make good decisions, they're going to be well placed in the next couple of years. And that means, how can you inform your customer? How can you, even without giving them kind of that brand promise, how can you help them know that the materials they're using have had an appropriate environmental impact or impact on other communities? And the second is, I think there's big opportunity in known technologies that outside of this current situation would seem too expensive to take to scale. And an example there is to solve this issue on plastic waste. One of the solutions at scale that's absolutely required is chemical recycling. Now, there's all sorts of debates about what the right approach is, which type of recycling are we talking about. We know we need massive investment in recycling. So to do that, the technologies are there. The problem is the business model is not there and it's too expensive to commercialize. Well, that's an innovation opportunity. So I would just say, look out there for the startup companies and the existing businesses that already have technologies that just haven't quite figured out the business model, because price parity is all of a sudden becoming pretty good with more traditional models that may have been subsidized through the existing system. The other area, just to get into the social side, because I know our audience here is a mix of social innovators, is that I think it's time for a hard look at the institutions that enable our system. What are the governing bodies that will exist to take our economy and our society into the next generation? We're living in a world that's structured with institutions that have been around for quite a long time. And to think, how does multi-stakeholder capitalism play out over the next 10 years? So PACE is an example of that, where we're a coalition of public and private partners. We bring together groups like NGOs, think tanks, like UN Environment, with companies. And this is a new mechanism to create a type of public and private action that wasn't necessarily might have been needed in the past, but now it's a very current, fast-moving type of mechanism to create change. So I would encourage people to look at what systems are needed and kind of institutions are needed around that to leverage change. Maybe just one final thing. I think this is very specific. Any technology or non-technology innovation that can provide transparency and traceability around information, materials, is going to be needed now and for the foreseeable future as we try to make our economic system and our democratic system more equitable. So, making access to information about what's in your phone as well as what's coming through your Facebook feed will be absolutely critically important.
I'm curious, something I wanted to touch on more, partnerships are such a core part of PACE. And what do you see as the future of partnerships in this area? What are the opportunities? What are the risks that we need to be taking into account as we're thinking about working across sectors to promote circular economy?
Yes, well, partnerships are kind of at the essence of circularity, because it requires rethinking how goods move across various uses when you want to extract, make something, reuse it, extend its life, and other things. So what we're finding is a lot of organizations, companies are integrating up and downstream Others, when you come to financing circular business models, you need more syndicate or consortia type funding models, and you might need to fund multiple different institutions. So whether it's a formal legal partnership is a secondary thing, but you definitely need a lot more collaboration within your supply chain. And within that, we see a big opportunity for scaling circular solutions where some of the front-running companies and countries have tested models, but there's an opportunity for crowding in around various industry groups. So how can we go from a few companies working with innovative technologies to industry-based strategies? And we see some opportunity for collaboration there.
That's great. You know, and I think sometimes we think of the innovations as a competitive advantage, you know, where it really helps one particular company advance their objectives. And in the case of circular economy, we really want to make sure that people are playing the same game, that everyone is abiding by the same rules to be able to promote the sustainable development goals and to ultimately improve our environment and improve social outcomes. You know, how do you both innovators and companies think about that? You know, how do you ensure that people are cooperating to be able to collectively improve this pretty intractable issue?
Right. Yeah, you know, it's coming from about a decade of doing innovation and technology work in developing countries before this role. You know, the thing that we usually talk about is that you compete on being first and best in market, not on the original idea. And I think that's just a reality, regardless of circular economy and the current economic situation and COVID crisis, that, you know, business models are going to evolve so fast, technologies are going to evolve so fast. You can patent what you can or copyright what you can, but really this is about going to market fast with good enough products and services. And so I think that's the main thing I would say. That fundamental is still there in innovation. And the other is, I'm a big believer in open innovation where possible. And just to highlight that partnerships idea, there's an opportunity for non-competitive collaboration, which I think often gets overlooked. So that's where you're going to work with, you're in healthcare, you're going to work with a company that's in manufacturing automobiles and someone who does software development. And you can share a lot of learning outside of your industry and test different things. And so in circular economy, an example is one of the partnerships we work with is the Capital Equipment Coalition. That's a group of non-competitive partners sharing learning around reverse supply chain logistics. That's great. They can be very transparent in their meetings and share learning. That's quite different than pre-competitive competition. An example there is the Global Plastics Action Partnership, where you'll see Coca-Cola and Pepsi working side by side on helping enable the scale up of policy frameworks and action on single-use plastics. Because they realize they have the same issue. They want to compete on their product, but they don't need to compete on plastics. And next, so they can have a pre-competitive competition, which is our collaboration, which is quite unique.
So it sounds like there's both a need for players that operate in different spaces to collaborate, that non-competitive competition, but also players who operate in the same space, perhaps they're both using plastics, to align on how they're going to be socially responsible and environmentally responsible with the same substances that they're working from.
Yeah, exactly. And even, you know, this plays out on the nation state level and with civil society organizations as well. You know, let's be real. Everyone's in a marketplace in some way, whether it's a marketplace of ideas or grants or customer acquisition, whatever it is. And so I would say that within the circular economy world, we're doing so much on partnerships and different types that we find there's ways to apply these different models of partnerships to these different situations. And the most complex are these types of systems transformations where we're trying to achieve. How do we get the whole world to rethink about how it uses natural resources and its impact on human lives and on the environment? And that requires, you know, shifts in how we've thought about oil and gas for the last 50 years, or how we've thought about what does development mean for the global South, and how do we encourage development there that might look different than how Northern European countries developed 100 years before. So I think that's where the competition doesn't come into the concept of collaboration. There's a big enough vision setting where you need to get broker agreement on a shared vision, not necessarily on all the little details where you might compete or on economic or on product levels.
That makes sense. The next question I have, it ties to something you were just speaking before, using the example of Coke and Pepsi, of Coca-Cola and PepsiCo. These are two very large companies. And I'm curious the role that you see large companies playing in advancing these circular economy approaches. And if you don't see them making the investments that perhaps would be for the good of advancing circularity, why do you think they can't do that right now?
Yeah, I mean, look, this has been an agenda that's gotten a lot of global attention because of the role of large companies and well-established economies. So on the government side, China is very active in this discussion, Japan, Korea, and there's a rising voice of other nation states that are leading on this agenda, who are, small, large, island states, you name it, it's a real mix. And the companies are the same. And I would say the one way that the companies are leading on it is they have resources to invest themselves. And when they make a commitment, they can take something to scale really fast. They also have the engines to deal with large, complex policy issues, which smaller startups might not be able to deal with. And another area is really the growth in financing mechanisms available to large companies, both green bonds, so how they finance their own research and development and innovation, which could then result in, say, acquisition or partnering with startups, as well as how they're using their own corporate venture capital is really interesting. So if you look, for example, at some of the, I would say some of the kind of materials companies or petrochemical businesses and how they're transforming their business models, they're really emphasizing technology, upstream and downstream integration, looking at resource efficiency, very sophisticated ways, and investing through their venture arms in new business models and new industries.
And I think that's one of the exciting things about the Zayed Sustainability Prize as well, is helping incubate some of those smaller ideas that could then, bubble up to these larger corporations, perhaps set best practices in these areas.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, look, there's a place, so you don't get caught in a trap of thinking large businesses don't innovate, right? Some are very nimble, they're very sophisticated in setting up innovation arms. But there is that moment for both unicorns that are going to create new markets and disrupt markets. And there's also a space for acquisitions and kind of growing to acquisition. And I think being very intentional depending on the stage of your startup, if it's your first 100 days, maybe this isn't where your head needs to be. But when you get to growth and sales, to sales and growth, then it's time to start really thinking about, what's the market play you're going for and how you're going to scale this idea. And is the best way going to be bootstrapping? Is it going to be through an acquisition, or is it going to be through some type of investment and IPO, things like this? And that's when you can start thinking about the different partnering models you might want to use and how to leverage large corporations.
And I'm curious if you feel like there are particular industries that we should be prioritizing for addressing circular economy approaches, or if it's agnostic across the board.
Yeah, I mean, I think very simply, like I was saying earlier, I think the main thing that you could do right now to ensure that your business survives for the next 20, 30 years is to help people make good decisions. And if you really want to lock in your solution, find ways to feed the growing population, ensure we have equitable and clean transportation, and that we have equitable access to technology and education. If you do that, the market is massively growing. You have massively growing middle classes, and across all those things, equity is a very interesting both social necessity. It's a moral imperative, but it's also a business opportunity where there are new people to engage, to employ, to work with. And so through the idea of being inclusive, you're going to come up with really innovative models on how to get access to rural communities or access to education. And there you'll test and develop technologies that could be applied in multiple different locations. I think that's where the real exciting opportunities are.
That's great. This is really helpful, David. And now I want to make sure that I include time for questions from the audience. And so we have a couple of questions coming in, so I will transition to that. The first question is, how do you think we can help organizations avoid their pressing need to return to business as usual and instead innovate new circular value propositions and business models?
Yeah, maybe this is a little bit of a non-answer, but I'll start with who I'm seeing right now through the crisis. Keep sustainability at the forefront. And they're ones who had sustainability embedded, ingrained in who they were. It wasn't a trade-off. And so being able to position, whether it's internally or to your investors, to your employees, to your customers, that by being an organization that considers the environment, considers your community or societal impact, you are a more stable, reliable, good partner. Then you're able to both manage risk in your supply chain, for example, as well as keep your customers loyal and engage them. Imagine you are in a position right now where you've never traded on trust. So you've made a product, you've never engaged with your customer, and they don't really have a relationship with your brand. And now there's a pandemic and you've got to have an honest conversation. And I saw this great YouTube clip that was like piecing together all the advertising on what the companies are saying. And the essence of it was basically they're just saying, we're here. Yeah. Because you haven't really communicated about your values to your customer. That's all you can say. You can only go to the point of presence, as opposed to we're here and this is how we're helping you through this and after this moment.
So it's really ensuring that companies are both articulating that they're present, but also articulating the value that they're bringing as a result.
Yeah, and it's hard to do that if you didn't embed this ethos of kind of a values base into your organization before a crisis hits. I know that doesn't answer the question of what do you do now. That's a separate one. So what I would do now is I would look at opportunities for pricing in risk, and I would look at seriously at essentially global trade and what the trends in globalization. That's kind of a mashup of globalization and localization. I think that's an area where we're seeing large, mid-sized, and small companies and countries really look at what's that right balance of where they source materials, where they manufacture them, where they remanufacture, et cetera, and the role of technology in enabling those supply chains. There's a lot to look at on appreciating that I think consumers right now, especially in the kind of more mature markets, are very in tune with their stuff and getting more in tune. So imagine what happened with plastics and the awakening that happened where people realized what's happening with single-use plastic. Now imagine that awakening around labor, which happened before, that awakening around the climate impact of their products. And you want to be there with your customer to be able to inform them in the right way, because you can make some really odd decisions if you don't have a lot of information. So I think just being ready to work with your customer really helps.
And do you think that awakening is still happening right now during the crisis, that customers are still thinking about the environmental and social responsibility of the products that they're consuming?
I think it's happening in some good and bad ways. I think people are aware, right? So you want to make the right decision for yourself. So let's imagine you want to make a healthy decision, and you don't know how to make that trade-off decision between using a single-use plastic that protects your food versus the environmental decision, and which solution is right. Do you use glass packaging or plastics? I think people are stuck a little bit, but without kind of clear insight. And that's where I say some of the momentum from before the pandemic could really help. There was a big momentum on packaging and labeling of products so that you could know not only what's in the product, but also kind of its impact and what to do with all the different elements of the product when you're finished with your use. And I see that potential continuing through this crisis.
You know, it's interesting. We actually got a question that's related to this from the audience. And this person's question was, many times consumers are blamed for their consumption behaviors, but at the same time, products are being designed with shorter lifespans. How do we reconcile the two? And so this is more getting at that, the product design element, but still talking about the behavior aspect as well.
Yeah. Let's tackle both of those. On one, I think we can't put the full burden of changing a system on individual consumers. Governments are consumers, businesses are consumers, and there's a lot of role for government procurement to play in setting some standards and sending market signals. So imagine a government saying that they are going to require a certain amount of post-consumer products, and therefore materials companies know how much product they need to source, and then therefore they will go create those conditions and work with users to know that they need to return product X back to this location, and they'll create those financial incentives. So there's a definite big role for governments to play, and we could standardize some of those rules and maybe processes more globally. There's a role for businesses to play in how they acquire and spend their own capital for even their operations, even NGOs. We should be looking at, as PACE at how we fly and how we consume different things as well. And then there is the consumer, and design is absolutely right. Design's not a magic solution. You've got to have the infrastructure, and you've got to have these big market signals. So I think just to finish off, there are two big sticking points right here. And this kind of answers a question you had earlier, what's keeping some big companies from this transition. One is that there is a block in the trade system where you can recycle all you want. So you can have the desire to recycle everything. Everything could be perfectly designed for recyclability or for reuse, but you've got to get that material to the right place and then sourced back to the country of manufacture or remanufacture. So you've got to address both the collection and infrastructure for processing, as well as trade barriers, and the trade barriers have been become an increasing problem over the last few years, not an enabler of this transition. Those are two areas we're working on tackling.
That's great. You know, and I think there's another question from the audience asking about the role of poor rural communities. So taking a step back from corporations and the broader supply chain, infrastructure, and what is their role in circular economy, and what are the opportunities for these communities?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's a broad. There's a lot of rural and poor, and those are distinct. They're not always the same. And so I would say it's different by each country, but one, there's individual human rights and autonomy and agency themselves. I think the role, maybe I'll start with a little bit my own responsibility, not living in a rural poor community. My responsibility is to consider people who are in rural and poor communities. And I think there's more that we can do to make sure when we're creating large agendas and priorities that we're getting the right sets of insights from these different communities who could be positively and negatively impacted. So I think it's our role to consider those communities with a view on equity and respect, and appreciating that there's also perhaps for some communities a need for transition and transition support. So that might mean that, well, in wealthy or poor, rural or urban communities, there will be some knowable but undesired impacts of any transition. You might want to upskill or change labor skills. You might move manufacturing. You might move production. So I would say we just need to consider those communities the same as we do urban, wealthy communities.
Yeah, that makes sense, of ensuring that they have the capacity and the support that they need to make these transitions the way that it impacts them. Well, David, we're at the end of our time. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your insights on circular economy, and thank you everyone for joining this webinar. We appreciate you taking the time. Please don't forget, spread the word about the fast approaching deadline for the Zayed Sustainability Prize on June 11th. For more information, visit www.zayedsustainabilityprize.com. You can also follow the Zayed Sustainability Prize on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn for future webinars and for the latest information on this exciting global competition. Thank you, everyone, and please stay safe.